Hey, welcome back everyone. We're again here broadcasting from my apartment, and we're continuing our coverage 5 days a week, Monday through Friday, focused, at least for now, heavily on this new coronavirus, this CCP virus. We have a great lineup today. We're going to be starting off with going into how U.S. lawmakers are now going after top-level Chinese officials for human rights abuses. We're also going to be talking about how Trump has laid out how the WHO misled the world on this virus. And despite all of this, the Chinese Communist Party is still arresting journalists, still covering up information, and we're going to be going over this as well. Before we get started, if you haven't already, please don't forget to like and subscribe. Again, it really helps us grow. I really appreciate the support. So first off, U.S. lawmakers going after Chinese officials for human rights abuses. Now, this open letter was put out by 3 Republican lawmakers, and they are invoking the Global Magnitsky Act to go after these top-level Chinese officials. This letter was sent by Jim Banks, Dan Crenshaw, and Lance Gooden to Treasury Secretary Stephen Mnuchin and Secretary of State Mike Pompeo. It notes not just the CCP's handling of the virus, but also lists some of the abuses of the Chinese regime, notably in this case against the Muslim Uyghurs. The letter states, quote, "We write to you today regarding the Chinese Communist Party's duplicitous, ineffective, and cruel response to the outbreak of COVID-19. We believe their actions violated the 2005 international health regulations, the human rights of their citizens, and basic principles of fairness and responsibility in international relations." Now, the letter lists how the CCP uses propaganda, how it arrested doctors and citizen journalists in some of its other crimes, and it also states that, quote, "In February 2019, Chinese officials relocated 30,000 Uyghur laborers to temporarily shuttered factories in Hotan Prefecture, exposing them to health risks the Chinese government deemed unacceptable to the ethnic Han majority." Now, as a bit of background, the Uyghurs are one of the persecuted minorities in China. They're a predominantly Muslim culture located in Xinjiang province. They are persecuted right alongside Tibetans, house Christians, Falun Gong practitioners. And the Chinese regime has been using them for things like slave labor, also putting them in concentration camps. Now, these lawmakers state they're using the Global Magnitsky Act, which lets governments freeze funds of foreign government officials that is held in U.S. banks. The letter states, quote, "We urge you to apply Global Magnitsky sanctions to the following individuals and entities for their complicity in human rights abuses and the harm they've inflicted on the United States and our allies." And it mentions several top-level officials, including Foreign Ministry spokesperson Zhao Lijiang. You may remember Zhao Lijiang making a lot of very contentious public statements on Twitter in the United States, even calling out U.S. politicians and spreading the Chinese regime's narrative, which is they're no longer really using anymore. But one of their main narratives previously stating that this virus was brought to China by the U.S. military. They're calling out Zhao directly for this, for amplifying the lies of the Chinese Communist Party. It is also calling out the chairman of Hikvision, Chen Zhongjian, for his company's manufacturing of surveillance equipment that is being used to persecute Uyghurs, and also calling out Politburo member Chen Chuang-go for being the, quote, mastermind in expanding the CCP's re-education camps, and it lists many others as well. Now, this letter is a major step in the United States countering the narratives of the Chinese Communist Party and also fighting back against their new wolf warrior diplomacy, this very hostile form of diplomacy that they've been using. Now, you may remember also how the Global Times, one of the Chinese regime's main state-run news outlets, was saying it was going to target individual U.S. lawmakers. It said China is going to fight back against the United States, and said that the CCP will not just go after them symbolically, but, quote, must hurt them. And it named several U.S. lawmakers, including Tom Cotton, Chris Smith, and Josh Hawley. This goes right back to the days of Mao Zedong and the Cultural Revolution, when the Chinese regime was making labels to attack its political enemies. And notably as well, this is where it gets important, The Chinese regime's attacks on lawmakers, it's calling them out, is based on these different lawmakers and different individuals calling for investigations into the origin of the virus, calling out the Chinese regime for its handling of the virus. It is calling them out for things that are not crimes. On the other hand, this letter calls out these Chinese officials on very similar grounds, but for actual possible crimes. And it is calling for actual sanctions based on those possible crimes. This is game over in terms of this narrative battle, at least on this level. And this sends a clear message to the Chinese Communist Party and to the different individuals carrying out its operations that they can be held individually liable for their actions. This is a major blow to them in that regard. And President Donald Trump is also now calling out the WHO on some similar grounds. He sent a letter to Dr. Tedros of the World Health Organization detailing how the WHO spread false information around this virus. You may remember on April 14th when President Trump suspended U.S. funding to the WHO, at least temporarily, while an investigation was launched into its handling of the virus.
And we're not happy about it, and we are by far the largest contributor to WHO, World Health. They misled us. I don't know. They must have known more than they knew. They're literally a pipe organ for China. That's the way I view it. So we're seeing and we're looking and we're watching.
This letter from Trump to Tedros lists 17 serious failings of the WHO in handling this virus. It states that there was a, quote, alarming lack of independence from the People's Republic of China. Among these, it states, quote, the World Health Organization has repeatedly made claims about the coronavirus that were either grossly inaccurate or misleading. And it goes on to detail these. It states at the end, quote, it is clear the repeated missteps by you and your organization, referring to Tedros and the WHO, in responding to the pandemic have been extremely costly for the world. The only way forward for the World Health Organization is if it can actually demonstrate independence from China. Now, in the letter, Trump says he's going to give the WHO 30 days to show, quote, major substantive improvements, or the temporary freeze that the U.S. has put on the funding to the WHO will become permanent, and the United States will also consider withdrawing from the WHO. And the letter ends with, quote, I cannot allow taxpayer dollars to continue to finance an organization that, in its present state, is so clearly not serving America's interests. Now, leading up to the publishing of this letter, Trump pulled an art of the deal on the WHO. You may remember some of these articles saying that Trump was considering restoring funding to the WHO. That may have been a play on words. He does state here that he would unfreeze its funds from the United States if it can show major substantive improvements. So you could argue he is considering renewing funding to it. But he pulled an art of the deal. And how did that work? He offered the gift first. He offered this narrative that maybe they're going to get their money back. And they're going to respond to that by thinking, oh great, here's what we can do with it. They're going to go through the process of thinking about what they can do with these funds. Then he's going to take that away from them, bring them back to the reality they're in, and then let them feel the pain from that loss, but then give them an open door and saying, if you want to have what you just felt, that hope you just had, you can sit down with me at the negotiating table and here are my terms. Now, whether or not the WHO will follow through on that, we'll have to see. It will be a major decisive point in terms of whether it can demonstrate independence from the Chinese Communist Party, which notably with this whole Taiwan incident, where it denied entry of Taiwan into the WHO, was an example of it not displaying this kind of independence. A pretty serious one, actually. And now back to the Chinese Communist Party. They have arrested another citizen journalist who is trying to warn the world about what's happening in China. This is from Business Insider. A fourth Chinese citizen journalist was reportedly detained after live streaming what life was like in Wuhan at the height of its coronavirus outbreak. Previously, 3 other citizen journalists were arrested. These are in addition to the different doctors who were arrested or pressured by the Chinese regime early on during the outbreak. And this is at a time when the Chinese regime is saying it has nothing to hide. This is at a time when the Chinese regime is saying that foreign investigators cannot come into China, saying that even suggesting that there should be investigations is hostile, racist, and anti-China. Meanwhile, they are putting their own people, Chinese nationals, Chinese citizens, in prison, possibly disappearing them, using other forms to silence them. And the Chinese regime is disappearing individuals who are trying to tell the world about the real situation of the virus. If the Chinese regime really has nothing to hide, then why does it feel the need to disappear, arrest, and sometimes, for example, one of these doctors, even have die in custody these different individuals who try telling the world what is happening in China? If they have nothing to hide, why do they feel that necessary? And now, in addition to this, based on these investigations that are pending right now into the origin of the virus, this is from 7 News Australia, China admits wet markets are patchy quality as Australia coronavirus inquiry gains backers. The timing and context of this is really important. Now, you may remember that the Chinese regime went from originally, in its first narrative, saying this virus came from the Huanan seafood market in Wuhan, that the outbreak started there and spread through China and then through the rest of the world from there. They changed that narrative back and forth. I won't go over the whole thing. But when people started calling out these marketplaces, what did the Chinese regime say? Because these markets were reopening in China. The narrative they had publicly was that there are no such thing as these wet markets in China. That China has no concept of these wet markets. Now it's saying that it is admitting these wet markets have patchy quality. That, maybe there was an issue with these markets suggesting that could have led to a virus outbreak. The timing of this is important. This takes place as different nations have brought this case to the World Health Association, that an investigation should be launched into the origin of this virus, to finding the origin of this virus. Notably, it also takes place after the scientific paper, which we discussed in a previous episode, said that this virus did not come from the marketplace. It did not spread within a marketplace. And so this is the Chinese regime pivoting. Now that they're saying that it did not spread from this marketplace, they're saying, oh, well, maybe there's a problem with the marketplaces. They're now trying to divert attention back to the marketplaces rather than the possibility of a lab leak, which is where all the attention is turning to right now. And this also shows something interesting, which is it demonstrates a level of panic within the Chinese regime's leadership when it comes to forming these different narratives. It's very hard to maintain a lie, because every time the lie changes, every time it gets exposed, you need to shift it to something else. And the regime, when it comes to the cover-up of this virus, has shifted that narrative so many times that they're contradicting themselves with their lies. They're going back and forth between information. And each time they do that, it contradicts them again and again. And also, CNN is reporting, quote, China could shape any result in its favor by putting off the WHO investigation until after the pandemic. Now, with that said, folks, what do you think? Do you think these U.S. lawmakers invoking the Magnitsky Act to go after these different Chinese officials is a good move? Do you agree with Trump's assessment on the WHO? And what do you think it says when the Chinese regime disappears new journalists? Do you agree with my analysis? Disagree? Let me know what you think in the comments below. That said, if you haven't already, please don't forget to like and subscribe. Again, it really helps this channel grow. We'll also be doing our broadcasts 5 days a week, Monday through Friday. And if you'd like to join the premieres, that's on YouTube, 10:30 Eastern Time. Now, folks, again, please take care of yourselves, stay healthy. We'll see you next time.